With the three main political parties in the UK now having completed their conferences for this year, we're talking now to John Rowland from Cicero Group about what we should know in the context of the Brexit negotiations. John, you just come back from the Conservative Party conference in Manchester, but of course you've also had a chance to listen to Jeremy Corbyn's main address to Labour and of course Vince Cable's address to the Liberal Democrats in September. What do we take away from what we've heard?
Well, it's been a fascinating party conference season. I think the things that we've seen in the short term may not be the big things for the long term. And I think clearly from a business perspective, there are two things that everybody's looking at, which is what's Theresa May's stability in office looking like and what are the market impacts of that? And secondly, what do the conferences mean for Brexit? Now, I think we all know where the Lib Dems are on Brexit. They want to turn it around. They want to roll it back. Now, the Labour Party is kind of ambiguous still on its Brexit policy. But what they have seemed to have agreed on is that they want a transition which is a single market transition that's probably a sort of a longer transition and not a short one. And what's happened in the Conservative Party is there seems to have been peace breaking out around the Florence speech, which is a transition of around 2 years in which the UK will make good the EU budget. So that's kind of where we are at the moment. But there's no absolute clarity from any party particularly on where they want to go, except for the Lib Dems, which is to reverse the whole thing, actually. Which,
of course, many are saying is not on the cards because that would need another referendum. No one seems to want to do that. OK, so let's go down the route in that case that we are on this course for Brexit. You publish your findings on where we are along this line of cliff edge to a nice smooth transition. Are we anywhere nearer one end now after we've had the conference season?
Well, I think the clear thing actually that the government did was actually before the conference season. So the Brexit issue was kind of set out in the Florence speech, and Theresa May there said, OK, here's a 2-year transition and this is what we're going for. And that was the first time there'd been actually any real clarity about what the government wanted from a transition. Before that, it was the concept of a transition that they were talking about, but there wasn't any real detail. So at least we've got that much now. But I think now the question is, firstly, will the EU agree to that transition? I think the signs of that are pretty good. But industry is asking a really important question, which is, if we're having a transition, what are we transitioning towards? And I think the fear may be that we're actually just transitioning towards another cliff edge. So you have a kind of 2-year extension, as it were. But what happens after that? And if there's no comprehensive agreement or heads of terms on that agreement, then really what you're doing is delaying the inevitable.
There has also been some anecdotal comment as well coming out of the EU as we've seen the conference season progress. I think more so around the Conservative Party and worries about leadership and where that's going. And the EU seem to be less than happy that there is a one-person voice, if you like, that's going towards this Brexit negotiation. Do you think that the EU is losing or has ever had an appetite to get an agreement, be it trade or otherwise? I mean, they seem to be stalling over the divorce payment as much as anything. Do you think that the EU really does want to negotiate? Is there any appetite for that?
Well, I think if you look at the phase one part of this negotiation, that's the basic divorce deal. I think the EU approach has been that there isn't really a great deal to negotiate about, actually, that they're very clear on what their demands are. And what they're expecting the UK to do is to largely step up and meet those demands. And in that sense, they would say, well, we've got the cards here because we're not going to talk about the future unless you deal with the present. Now, that's what's being said in public, but I think there's a little bit of movement around the edges. For example, the Irish issue, which is a phase one issue, is extremely complicated, and that cannot be agreed without negotiation. And it can't really be agreed without some idea about what the future customs and trade relationship might be. I think on the money, the UK has moved towards a sensible position, which is we'll make good the budget, but there's still a big discussion to be had about future liabilities. And on the third part, which is citizens' rights, the major point that's of contention there is about how that agreement might be enforced, and the Europeans are saying that must be in the ECJ, and the UK is saying no way. Now that is a point that's going to need some kind of agreement, because right now there's no middle ground unless there's a kind of a third-party dispute resolution mechanism. So that's where we are in phase one. Now phase two, there's a lot more to be discussed there, because that's a very open-ended agreement, and that will be more like the give and take of a normal free trade agreement, I think.
Is there a general consensus in the city and amongst business leaders in the UK as to where we should be going?
Yeah, I think everybody accepts that we're leaving the European Union unless something radical changes, and of course that could happen. But the central scenario is the same. We're leaving the single market, we're leaving the EU, there will be no ECJ jurisdiction and there will be no freedom of movement. So I think that is broadly accepted. The question behind that is, will there be a deal or will it be a no-deal situation? So in other words, will there be an orderly Brexit or a disorderly one? And in the worst-case scenario planning for some firms, they will be saying, well, what does happen if there's no deal? And they will make sure that they've got contingencies in place for that to happen. So they'll plan for the worst and hope for the best, obviously.
And that's a cliff edge?
So that would be a cliff edge. So that the no-deal situation is the most extreme of the cliff edges because it's not really clear what's on the other side. You become a third country and all those access, say for example in financial services, market access is based on passporting now. That would then move to an equivalence mechanism which is not as certain and it's not as comprehensive. So from a business perspective, as I say, it's plan for the worst and hope for the best.
Yeah. Okay, all right, John, thanks so much indeed for joining us. John Rowland is there from Cicero Group with an update on where we are along the line of those negotiations and the path to Brexit.